Imagine uncovering the layers of a story so profoundly impactful that it has shaped continents, cultures, and the very fabric of modern society. The Atlantic slave trade, a grim chapter in human history, is often reduced to a tale of economics and labor demands. But what if there were deeper, more sinister motivations lurking beneath the surface? Motivations that history books have scarcely dared to touch. Today, we embark on a journey to unearth the untold reasons behind the Atlantic slave trade, exploring the complex web of interests that fueled this inhuman enterprise. This documentary will take you beyond the conventional narratives, delving into the political machinations, societal ideologies, and hidden economies that played pivotal roles in the perpetuation of the slave trade. As we peel back the layers, we will confront uncomfortable truths and challenge the sanitized versions of history that have long dominated our understanding. From the corridors of European powerhouses to the devastated communities of Africa, from the opulent offices of insurance companies to the dark waters of the Atlantic, this story is not just about the past. It's a crucial examination of how history's shadows continue to loom over the present. Join us as we reveal the untold stories, the obscured motives, and the dark dealings that have been excluded from the popular discourse. This is not just a recounting of history. It is a call to understand the depths of human greed and moral compromise, and to recognize the enduring impacts that these centuries-old decisions have on our world today. Stay with us, as what you learn today might change your understanding of the past and, more importantly, how we approach the future. The Atlantic slave trade, also known as the transatlantic slave trade, stands as one of the most inhumane chapters in human history. Spanning approximately from the late 15th century to the mid-19th century, this dark period involved the mass forced migration and enslavement of millions of African people by European colonizers. The reasons behind this trade were complex, intertwining economic interests with deeply flawed moral justifications. Understanding the timeline and the scale, as well as the economic theories that fueled this trade, offers crucial insights into how deeply it has shaped the world. The origins of the Atlantic slave trade can be traced back to the mid-15th century, when Portuguese traders began to transport slaves from West Africa to Europe. Initially, these slaves were used for domestic work and small-scale labor projects. However, the scope of the trade expanded dramatically in the 16th century. With the discovery of the Americas, the vast agricultural lands of the New World required a labor force capable of sustaining large-scale farming operations, particularly in sugar, tobacco, and later, cotton plantations. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the trade had reached its peak. Britain, Portugal, France, Spain, and the Netherlands were heavily involved, with Britain eventually becoming the largest slave trader. The infamous triangular trade system was established during this period. European ships traveled to Africa loaded with goods, which were exchanged for captured Africans. These individuals were then transported across the Atlantic under brutal conditions in the Middle Passage. Upon reaching the Americas, they were sold into slavery, and the ships returned to Europe with raw materials such as sugar, cotton, and tobacco. It is estimated that between 12 and 15 million Africans were forcibly transported to the Americas during the 400 years of the Atlantic slave trade. The human cost in terms of suffering, death, and disruption to African societies was staggering. The demographic impact alone was profound, with entire generations removed from communities, leading to long-term economic and social consequences for the African continent. Economically, the Atlantic slave trade was justified by the demand for labor in the burgeoning colonies of the New World. The European colonial economies were heavily reliant on agriculture, and the plantations required a vast and inexpensive labor force. African slaves were deemed the most economical solution, primarily due to their resilience to diseases and familiarity with agricultural techniques suitable for tropical climates. Several economic theories have been proposed to explain the persistence and scale of the trade. One of the most prominent is the mercantilist theory, which was the prevailing economic doctrine of the time. Mercantilism advocated for a positive balance of trade, where countries aimed to export more than they imported, amassing wealth in the form of precious metals. Colonies were seen as both sources of raw materials and markets for manufactured goods. Slavery provided the labor necessary to extract these materials cheaply, thus fueling the economic engine of European powers. Another theory revolves around the concept of capitalism and its intrinsic drive for accumulation and profit maximization. Some historians argue that the slave trade was not just a byproduct of racism or economic necessity, but was integral to the early development of global capitalism. The trade created a system where human lives were commodified as part of the pursuit of profit, setting a precedent for the exploitation of labor that some would argue persists in various forms to this day. The Atlantic slave trade, often viewed through the lens of economic necessity, was also deeply intertwined with the political ambitions and social structures of the time. Below, we explore how European powers leveraged this grim enterprise for political dominance, how societal norms supported such exploitation, and the lesser-known economic engines that fueled the trade. The use of slave trading by European powers as a tool for political dominance and territorial expansion is a stark reminder of the complexities of human motives. Nations like Portugal and Spain were pioneers in the slave trade, not merely for economic gain but as a strategy to expand their empires. The competition among European powers was fierce. Control over the slave trade routes was tantamount to holding the reins of global influence. For instance, the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, which divided the newly discovered lands outside Europe between Portugal and Spain, was not just about land, but also about controlling the routes that would later be crucial for the slave trade. Similarly, the British, Dutch, and French entered the trade as part of their broader strategy to enhance their global stature, finance their naval fleets, and establish colonies in the Americas. Each colony served as a node in a vast commercial network, and the human cargo that was forcibly moved across the Atlantic served as a gruesome currency in the geopolitical games of the time. For these European nations, dominance in the slave trade equated to economic and political power, giving them leverage over their rivals in all corners of the world. The societal beliefs and ideologies of the time not only justified but necessitated the exploitation inherent in the slave trade. Racial theories were concocted to legitimize the enslavement of African peoples, portraying them as lesser beings predestined for servitude. These dehumanizing views were propagated through various channels: literature, art, and later, pseudoscientific research, which reinforced the notion that Africans were inherently suited for hard labor and that enslaving them was a favor to their civilization. Religious justifications also played a critical role. The concept of the white man's burden, although more commonly associated with the later period of imperial expansion, has its roots in the era of the slave trade. European colonizers believed it was their divine duty to Christianize and civilize African peoples, a notion that was widely used to morally justify the brutal practices of the slave trade. These societal structures were not passive backdrops but active components in sustaining the trade. They shaped public opinion and policy, creating an environment where the trade could thrive openly and without significant moral opposition from the mainstream society of the time. Beyond the direct profits from the trade of enslaved Africans, there were significant, albeit lesser-known, economic benefits that permeated several sectors of European economies. Insurance companies, for instance, emerged as key players in the slave trade by providing insurance for slave ships and their human cargo. This practice was not only profitable but also reduced the risk for slave traders, encouraging more ventures into this inhumane trade. The banking sector also saw a tremendous benefit. Banks in London, Amsterdam, and other trade hubs offered loans to slave traders and plantation owners at lucrative rates, underwriting the expansion of the trade and, by extension, the colonial projects in the Americas. This financial backing was crucial in sustaining the trade over centuries. Moreover, the slave trade stimulated growth in ancillary industries. Shipbuilding, for example, saw significant advances due to the demand for ships capable of transporting large numbers of enslaved people across the Atlantic. Provisions for voyages, including food and chains, created bustling markets that provided goods for the journey. Each part of this network was a cog in a vast machine, profiting from the trade that so deeply scarred millions of lives. These intertwined elements, political ambitions, societal beliefs, and hidden economic benefits, demonstrate that the motivations behind the Atlantic slave trade were complex and multifaceted. Understanding these reasons helps us grasp the full scope of this dark period in human history, reminding us of the profound impacts that greed and prejudice can have on society. By examining these untold reasons, we not only better understand the past, but also gain insights into the lingering inequalities that continue to affect the modern world. The slave trade had a catastrophic impact on the population of Africa. Between the 15th and 19th centuries, it is estimated that over 12 million Africans were forcibly taken from their homelands and transported across the Atlantic. This massive extraction of the population, primarily from West and Central Africa, led to severe demographic imbalances. The regions most heavily targeted saw a significant depletion of their young and able-bodied men and women, the very individuals who were crucial for economic stability and social development. The demographic shifts were not just in numbers. The removal of such a large portion of the population also skewed the age and sex ratios, leaving behind a society with fewer young people and a disproportionate number of elderly and children. This imbalance posed challenges in several traditional roles, particularly in agriculture and defense, affecting the productivity and security of communities. The cultural impact of the slave trade on African societies was equally profound. As millions of people were uprooted from their communities, vital aspects of cultural identity and heritage were lost. Languages, religious practices, and traditional arts faced disruptions as the social fabric of communities was torn apart. The slave trade also led to the spread of firearms in Africa, which were often traded for slaves. This not only changed the nature of conflicts within Africa, but also altered societal structures, empowering some groups over others and leading to further destabilization. Moreover, the psychological impact of the slave trade created deep-seated trauma and mistrust within communities. Families lived in constant fear of raiding parties and kidnappings, which could occur at any moment. This fear had a lasting impact on communal life and social cohesion, as trust, a fundamental element of community life, was severely undermined. Despite the overwhelming adversities, African communities were not passive victims of the slave trade. Many resisted the slave traders actively, while others developed strategies for resilience and adaptation. Resistance took many forms, from revolts on slave ships to runaway slave communities forming maroon societies in the Caribbean and the Americas. In Africa itself, communities developed strategies to avoid capture, such as relocating their villages to more remote and inaccessible areas. Kingdoms like the Ashanti of modern-day Ghana and the Dahomey of modern-day Benin were known for their military resistance against slavery. The story of Queen Nzinga of Ndongo and Matamba, present-day Angola, is a notable example of resistance. She fought fiercely against the Portuguese and their slave-trading practices. Her diplomatic skills and military strategies allowed her to form alliances and maintain the independence of her kingdoms for decades. Resilience manifested in various cultural retentions and adaptations. Africans transported across the Atlantic took with them pieces of their cultures, which they preserved and adapted to their new environments. This is evident in music, cuisine, religious practices, and languages that have influenced the Americas' cultural landscapes. In Africa, communities that suffered from the slave trade found ways to rebuild and adapt their cultural practices, despite the loss of many of their members. They preserved oral histories and traditions, passing down stories of endurance and survival that have strengthened communal bonds and helped maintain a sense of identity. Throughout the course of the Atlantic slave trade, European perspectives and justifications for slavery were deeply entwined with propaganda, economic interests, and complex moral arguments. These elements shaped societal views and rationalized a system that, by modern standards, is unequivocally inhumane. To understand how such a trade could not only exist but flourish, requires a dive into the historical context of the time, the economic imperatives, and the moral gymnastics performed by European societies. Propaganda played a crucial role in shaping European public opinion on slavery. The portrayal of African individuals in European media was manipulated to support the trade. Africans were often depicted as savages needing salvation, or as inherently inferior beings suited only for servitude. This portrayal was not incidental, but a deliberate effort to create a narrative that justified the exploitation under the guise of a civilizing mission. Print media, sermons, and later cultural exhibitions showcased Africans and their cultures through a distorted lens that emphasized their otherness and primitiveness. These depictions were pervasive and reinforced the notion that slavery was not only acceptable but also a benevolent act by Europeans to civilize these so-called lesser peoples. By framing the narrative in this manner, the real economic motives of slavery could be cloaked with a veneer of moral righteousness. The economic justifications for slavery were rooted in its immense profitability. The triangle trade, involving the exchange of goods between Europe, Africa, and the Americas, was lucrative. European merchants would trade manufactured goods for slaves in Africa, then sell these slaves in the Americas, where they would purchase plantation products like sugar, tobacco, and cotton to bring back to Europe. The wealth generated from this trade was not marginal, but foundational to the economies of many European port cities and the broader national economies. Beyond direct trade, slavery bolstered ancillary industries such as shipbuilding, insurance, and banking. Many of Europe's financial institutions were implicated in the slave trade, providing the capital needed for slave ships and plantation developments. The economic benefits extended into wider society, creating jobs in ports, increasing demand for goods, and contributing to the overall wealth of the nation. This financial dependency made slavery an entrenched part of European economic structures. The moral and legal justifications for slavery during this period were complex and often contradictory. On one hand, there were strong Christian teachings against the cruelty and injustice of enslaving fellow human beings. On the other hand, pro-slavery advocates argued that slavery was sanctioned by the Bible and a necessary evil for economic prosperity. Laws such as the Code Noir in France were enacted not only to regulate the treatment of slaves, but also to provide a legal framework that acknowledged slavery as an institution. In Britain, the Somerset case of 1772, which resulted in a de facto end to slavery on British soil, highlighted the legal ambiguities and started a gradual movement towards abolition. Yet, it took many more decades and a growing abolitionist movement to bring about legal end to the trade in Europe, with the Slave Trade Act of 1807 in Britain and similar laws in other nations. The moral arguments for slavery were often intertwined with economic reasoning. Proponents argued that slavery was necessary for the prosperity of the colonies and, by extension, the European metropoles. Economic arguments were frequently dressed up in moral clothes, suggesting that without slavery, the savage Africans would not be exposed to Christianity and the civilized world. The Atlantic slave trade did not merely shuffle populations and destabilize African societies. It significantly molded the contours of the modern world, influencing early globalism and creating a legacy of racial and economic disparities that persist into the present day. This chapter examines how this trade in human lives facilitated the development of a globally interconnected economy and sowed the seeds for enduring racial tensions and economic inequalities. The Atlantic slave trade was a cornerstone of early globalism, intertwining the destinies of continents and paving the way for the modern globalized world. As European powers colonized the New World, their insatiable demand for labor to exploit the newly discovered land's vast resources became apparent. This demand led to the establishment of the triangular trade system, a complex international trade network that linked Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Ships from Europe would carry manufactured goods to Africa, where they were exchanged for slaves. These slaves were then transported across the Atlantic to the Americas in a horrific journey known as the Middle Passage. Once in the Americas, the slaves were forced to work on plantations, producing commodities such as sugar, tobacco, and cotton, which were then shipped back to Europe, completing the triangle. This trade network did more than just circulate goods and enslaved people. It was instrumental in the development of international banking and finance systems, which were necessary to support the extensive credit needs of the trade. The proliferation of these economic practices laid the groundwork for modern capitalism. Moreover, the interaction between European colonists, African slaves, and indigenous peoples in the Americas facilitated a cultural exchange that, while often oppressive, contributed to the cultural and demographic makeup of entire regions. The legacy of the Atlantic slave trade has left a deep imprint on racial dynamics around the world, particularly in the Americas. The social constructs of race developed during this era to rationalize the brutal exploitation of African labor. These constructs entrenched a hierarchy that placed white Europeans at the top and black Africans at the bottom. A hierarchy that has proven stubbornly resilient over centuries. In the United States, for example, the abolition of slavery did not erase the socio-economic barriers constructed around racial lines. Segregation, disenfranchisement, and systemic discrimination were maintained through Jim Crow laws and other institutional practices, many of which have echoes in today's systems of inequality. African Americans continue to face significant challenges in accessing quality education, employment, housing, and healthcare, contributing to a cycle of poverty and marginalization. Furthermore, the racial prejudices incubated during the slave trade era continue to affect societal attitudes, resulting in systemic racism that permeates law enforcement, the judicial system, and the political landscape. The recent movements for racial justice across the globe underscore the ongoing struggle against these deep-seated inequities. The economic impact of the slave trade has been profound and long-lasting, particularly in the regions that were most directly involved. In the Americas, the wealth generated by slave labor contributed significantly to the economic development of countries like the United States and Brazil. However, the benefits of this wealth have been unevenly distributed, often enriching a small segment of society while the descendants of slaves remain disproportionately impoverished. In Africa, the slave trade contributed to a legacy of political instability and economic underdevelopment. The extraction of millions of young and able-bodied individuals had a devastating impact on the continent's demographic and economic potential. Many African nations continue to struggle with the effects of this demographic hollowing, compounded by subsequent eras of colonial exploitation and corrupt governance that have hindered development and perpetuated poverty. Moreover, the economic structures established during the colonial period have persisted, with many African countries remaining exporters of raw materials while importing finished goods, a pattern that limits economic growth and perpetuates reliance on former colonial powers. As we conclude our journey through the dark corridors of the Atlantic slave trade, it's crucial to reflect on the full breadth and depth of the motivations that drove this heinous period in human history. Understanding these motivations isn't just about recounting the past. It's about unraveling the complex tapestry of human behavior and the profound influence of economic greed. This reflection isn't merely academic, it's a vital step towards ensuring such atrocities are never repeated. The Atlantic slave trade was not just a byproduct of economic necessity, but a manifestation of calculated exploitation underpinned by deep-seated racial ideologies and political ambitions. European powers, driven by a relentless hunger for wealth and dominance, engineered a system of human bondage that was justified through twisted narratives of racial superiority and civilizational missions. This system was not an anomaly, but a reflection of a broader pattern of exploitation and dehumanization that, unfortunately, didn't end with the abolition of the slave trade. Understanding this history teaches us about the dangers of unchecked power and greed. It shows how economic incentives can corrupt moral values and lead to justifications for the most inhumane acts. The scars left by the slave trade are not just physical, but deeply embedded in the social and economic fabrics of nations on both sides of the Atlantic. The demographic shifts, the cultural upheavals, and the lingering socioeconomic disparities seen today are direct legacies of this tragic past. Moreover, this understanding prompts a call to action. It compels us to remember and learn from history, to recognize the signs of impending injustices, and to stand firmly against them. It urges us to question the structures of power and wealth that persistently marginalize and exploit under the guise of progress and development. In light of this, our responsibility extends beyond passive remembrance. We must actively engage with history, challenging the narratives that have long been accepted without scrutiny. We must educate ourselves and others, not just about the facts of the slave trade, but about the ongoing impacts and the lessons it teaches us about human rights, equality, and justice. Let this documentary be a starting point for deeper exploration and understanding. Let it ignite conversations about the past and its implications for our present and future. As we continue to uncover more truths that have been hidden in plain sight, let us be motivated not by mere curiosity, but by a commitment to justice and a desire to prevent history's darkest chapters from repeating. This is why your engagement doesn't end with this documentary. Subscribe to stay informed and stay tuned as we delve into more untold stories that shape our world. Together, we can keep the memory of the past alive, ensuring that we learn its lessons and build a future where such injustices are relics of history, never to be repeated. Remember, history is not just about understanding what happened, it's about understanding why it happened and ensuring that the errors and horrors of the past do not define the future. So, let us step forward with this knowledge. Armed with the power to make a difference, let's be vigilant and proactive in our communities and beyond, championing the cause of justice and equality. Join us as we continue this important work. Your support is crucial in our journey to bring more such stories to light, stories that need to be told to safeguard the essence of humanity against the corrosive effects of greed and discrimination. Together we can make a difference, one story, one truth at a time. Thank you for joining us on this enlightening journey. Let's keep the flame of understanding burning bright and continue to seek out and share the lessons that history has to offer. Your engagement, curiosity, and thirst for truth are what drive this mission forward. Subscribe, share, and stay engaged. The path to a better future is one of knowledge, understanding, and action. Let's walk it together.